In the heart of London, where history and modernity blend seamlessly, a young traveler named Emily found herself captivated by the city's charm. With her camera slung around her neck and a map tucked into her bag, she wandered through cobblestone streets lined with historic buildings, each one whispering stories of the past. Her excitement was palpable as she made her way toward Buckingham Palace, the iconic home of British royalty. She had seen pictures of the palace countless times, but being there in person felt like stepping into a storybook. As Emily approached the grand gates of the palace, her eyes widened at the sight before her. Standing tall and proud were the famous guardsmen, their crimson tunics and towering bearskin hats making them look larger than life. Tourists swarmed around, snapping photos and pointing excitedly at the soldiers who stood motionless, their faces expressionless. Emily joined the crowd, marveling at how these men seemed almost statue-like, their discipline unwavering despite the buzzing activity around them. Her curiosity deepened as she observed the intricate details of their uniforms. The shiny black boots, perfectly polished, reflected the sunlight, while the golden buttons on their jackets gleamed with precision. But it was the bearskin hats that truly captured her attention. Towering high above their heads, the hats looked both regal and mysterious. Emily tilted her head, wondering what it must feel like to wear something so massive and imposing. Were they heavy? Did they get hot under the summer sun? Questions swirled in her mind as she stared at the nearest guardsman. The atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter and chatter from visitors speaking different languages. A group of teenagers nearby joked about the hats, one of them pretending to tip an imaginary cap off a guard's head. Everyone laughed, including Emily, though she couldn't help feeling a pang of curiosity. What if she could try one on, just for a moment? Surely it would be harmless. And imagine the photo she could take. It would be the perfect souvenir, something to show her friends back home and make them laugh. Encouraged by the playful energy around her, Emily lingered near the guardsmen longer than most tourists did. One particular soldier caught her eye. He stood ramrod straight, his face unreadable, exuding an air of authority that seemed almost otherworldly. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to act on her whimsical thought. But then, emboldened by the lighthearted banter of those around her, she decided to go for it. After all, what harm could come from asking? With a mix of nervousness and excitement, Emily stepped closer to the guardsman. "Excuse me," she said cheerfully, her voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. When he didn't respond, she repeated herself, this time louder. Still nothing. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement crossed his face. For a fleeting second, doubt crept into her mind. Was this really a good idea? But before she could reconsider, her adventurous spirit took over. In a bold move she would soon regret, Emily reached out and plucked the enormous bearskin hat right off the soldier's head. For a split second, everything froze. The laughter around her died down, replaced by gasps of shock. Emily held the hat triumphantly above her head, grinning ear to ear as if she'd just won some sort of prize. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the unexpected scene. But as the novelty wore off, Emily began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she had crossed a line. As Emily stood there, holding the towering bearskin hat aloft, her grin began to falter. The initial thrill of her impulsive act quickly gave way to a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. She had expected laughter, maybe even applause, from the crowd around her. Instead, an eerie silence settled over the scene, broken only by the faint hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Every eye was on her. Tourists, guardsmen, even palace staff, all frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The weight of the hat hit her first, both literally and figuratively. It felt far heavier than she had imagined, like trying to balance a sack of potatoes on her head. Her arms instinctively shot up to steady it, but even then, the strain was immediate. The thick fur pressed down uncomfortably, making her feel unsteady on her feet. For a moment, she thought she might drop it altogether. "Wow," she muttered under her breath, half to herself and half to no one in particular. This thing is way heavier than it looks. But the physical burden wasn't the only thing weighing on Emily. As she glanced around, she noticed the expressions on the faces of those watching her. Some tourists looked amused, whispering behind their hands or snapping photos with smirks on their faces. Others, however, appeared uneasy, glancing nervously between Emily and the now hapless guardsman. And then there was the guardsman himself. His once stoic demeanor had shifted ever so slightly. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed as he stared directly at her. There was no anger in his gaze. Not yet, but something colder, a quiet authority that sent a shiver down her spine. "Oh, sorry," Emily offered weakly, lowering the hat slightly as if testing whether this would ease the tension. But the guardsman didn't respond. He simply stood there, his towering figure looming over her, waiting. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, unsure of what would happen next. A few people began to edge away, sensing that this was no longer a lighthearted moment, but something more serious. It was then that Emily realized her mistake wasn't just about taking the hat. It was about crossing an invisible boundary. These guards weren't props for entertainment. They were part of a centuries-old tradition, symbols of discipline and duty. By removing the hat, she hadn't just disrupted the ceremony. She had disrespected the uniform and everything it represented. The playful energy that had fueled her earlier suddenly felt reckless and childish. Her friends, who had initially encouraged her antics, now looked uneasy. One of them whispered urgently, "Emily, give it back." Another tugged at her sleeve, urging her to hand the hat over before things got worse. But Emily hesitated, unsure how to undo what she had done. Should she apologize, offer an explanation, or simply return the hat without drawing further attention to herself? Before she could decide, another guard stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured. Unlike the first, this man spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Madam," he said, addressing her directly, "please return the hat immediately." The words carried a weight that left no room for argument. Emily's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she fumbled to comply, nearly dropping the cumbersome object in her haste. When the hat finally landed back on the soldier's head, she let out a shaky sigh of relief. But the ordeal was far from over. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath. Emily stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding as she braced herself for whatever came next. Whatever punishment awaited her, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't be forgetting this day anytime soon. As soon as the bearskin hat left Emily's hands and returned to its rightful place atop the guardsman's head, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She had only worn it for a few seconds, but those moments felt like an eternity. The weight of the hat was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. Her forehead glistened with sweat, her hair damp and clinging uncomfortably to her skin. The thick fur had trapped heat like a furnace, making her feel lightheaded and disoriented. For the first time, she understood why the guardsmen stood so still. They weren't just following orders, they were conserving energy. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil brewing inside her. As the initial shock wore off, reality began to sink in. This wasn't just some harmless prank or silly tourist stunt. It was a breach of protocol, one that carried consequences far beyond what she had anticipated. The stern gaze of the guardsman hadn't softened, and the other guard who had spoken to her earlier now stood nearby, his posture rigid and unyielding. His calm tone earlier had masked a steely authority that made Emily feel even smaller than before. "Madam," he said again, breaking the uneasy silence, "you've committed a serious offense." His word hung in the air, sharp and final. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper. She wanted to explain herself, to tell him it was all a misunderstanding. But no words came out. How could she justify something so reckless? All she could manage was a shaky nod, her eyes darting between the two soldiers, searching for any sign of leniency. The second guard continued, his voice steady but firm. "These uniforms are not costumes. They are symbols of duty and honor, representing centuries of tradition. What you did is disrespectful, not only to us but to the institution we serve." Each word landed like a hammer blow, chipping away at Emily's confidence and replacing it with shame. She had always considered herself respectful and thoughtful, someone who appreciated history and culture. Yet here she was, standing in front of these men, feeling like the exact opposite. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything. Why hadn't she thought this through? Hadn't she seen enough documentaries about Buckingham Palace to know better? The answer was simple: she hadn't been thinking at all. Caught up in the moment, fueled by curiosity and peer pressure, she had acted without considering the implications. And now she was paying the price for her impulsiveness. The crowd that had gathered earlier had mostly dispersed by now, though a few stragglers lingered, watching the scene unfold with morbid fascination. Some snapped photos, their phones raised discreetly, while others whispered among themselves. Emily caught fragments of their conversations. "She shouldn't have done that," one person muttered. Another replied, "It's not like she meant harm, though." Their divided opinions mirrored her own inner conflict. Part of her wanted to argue that it had been a harmless mistake, but deep down, she knew better. Harmless mistakes didn't leave people sweating profusely under stolen military hats, while uniformed soldiers lectured them on respect and tradition. To make matters worse, another figure appeared. A senior officer, judging by the insignia on his uniform. He approached silently, his presence commanding immediate attention. The two guardsmen straightened even further, if that was possible, and addressed him briefly. Whatever they said, it wasn't good news for Emily. The officer turned to her, his expression unreadable but undeniably serious. Without saying a word, he gestured for her to follow him. Emily hesitated, her legs trembling beneath her. Every instinct told her to run, to disappear into the crowd and pretend none of this had happened. But she knew that wasn't an option. Instead, she forced herself to take a step forward, then another, until she was walking alongside the officer toward a nearby building within the palace grounds. As they moved, she couldn't help but glance back at the guardsmen one last time. Their faces remained impassive, their stances unwavering. To them, she was just another tourist who had failed to understand the gravity of her actions. By the time they reached the entrance, Emily's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure everyone around her could hear it. Her palms were clammy, and her thoughts spiraled wildly. What would happen next? Would she be arrested? Fined? Banned from visiting Buckingham Palace forever? Whatever awaited her inside, she braced herself for the worst. One thing was certain. This trip to London would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Inside the small office within the palace grounds, Emily sat perched on the edge of a wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room was plain but orderly, with framed photographs of past ceremonies lining the walls, and a desk that looked as if it had seen decades of service. Across from her sat the senior officer who had escorted her inside, his demeanor calm yet authoritative. Beside him stood one of the guardsmen whose hat she had taken, his towering figure making the modest space feel even smaller. Emily couldn't bring herself to meet their eyes. Instead, she focused on the scuffed toes of her sneakers, her mind racing with fear and regret. The senior officer cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Miss," he began, his tone measured but firm, "do you understand why your actions were inappropriate?" Emily nodded quickly, though her voice caught in her throat when she tried to speak. She swallowed hard and forced herself to look up, meeting his gaze for the first time. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean any disrespect. I wasn't thinking." The officer studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands on the desk. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice taking on a more instructive tone. "These uniforms, the tunics, the boots, the hats, they aren't costumes or props. They represent centuries of tradition, discipline, and sacrifice. Every detail has meaning, especially the bearskin hat. He paused, gesturing toward the guardsman beside him. This hat is made from the fur of Canadian black bears, sourced sustainably and crafted by skilled artisans. It takes months to create just one. Its size and weight are intentional. They symbolize strength, endurance, and authority. Wearing it isn't easy, but that's the point. It's a reminder of the responsibility these men carry as representatives of the crown. Emily listened intently, her guilt deepening with every word. She had thought of the hat as nothing more than an interesting piece of attire, something exotic to marvel at during her vacation. But now, hearing the history and significance behind it, she realized how little she truly understood. This wasn't just about fashion or pageantry. It was about honor and respect, values she had unknowingly trampled on. The officer continued, his voice softening slightly. When you removed that hat, you disrupted not only the ceremony, but also the dignity of the uniform. These men stand guard regardless of weather conditions, crowds, or distractions. Their role requires immense focus and discipline, and they take great pride in what they do. Your actions undermine that. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked rapidly, willing them away, but the lump in her throat refused to budge. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice trembling. I swear I didn't mean to cause trouble. I thought it would be funny, a silly picture, but now I see how wrong I was. Her words tumbled out in a rush, each syllable heavy with remorse. The officer nodded slowly, his expression softening further. I believe you didn't intend harm, he said, but ignorance doesn't excuse behavior like this. You're not the first tourist to make such a mistake, and you won't be the last. That's why we have rules, to protect both our traditions and visitors like yourself. He opened a folder on his desk and pulled out a document. Here's what will happen next, he explained. We'll record your details and issue you a formal warning. Additionally, you'll be banned from returning to Buckingham Palace for 6 months. If anything like this happens again, the consequences will be far more severe. Emily nodded fervently, relief washing over her despite the restrictions. At least she wasn't being arrested or fined. It could have been much worse. Still, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She knew this incident would follow her long after she left London, not only because of the ban, but because of the lesson she had learned. As the officer handed her the paperwork to sign, he added one final remark. Take this experience to heart. Learn from it. Respect isn't just given. It's earned through understanding and appreciation. Perhaps next time, you'll think twice before acting impulsively. Emily signed the document without hesitation, her signature shaky but sincere. When she handed it back, she looked up at the guardsman standing silently beside the desk. I'm so sorry, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. He gave her a curt nod, his expression unchanged, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was enough to let her know she hadn't completely ruined everything. As she stepped out of the office and into the fresh air, Emily took a deep breath, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. Back in her hotel room later that evening, Emily sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at the blank screen of her laptop. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. Her impulsive grab for the bearskin hat, the shocked faces of the crowd, the stern lecture from the senior officer, and the quiet nod from the guardsman. Each memory brought a fresh wave of embarrassment, but also a determination to make things right. She knew saying sorry wasn't enough. She needed to show that she truly understood the gravity of what she had done. Her first step was research. Determined to learn more about the traditions she had so carelessly dismissed, Emily began digging into the history of the household division, the elite group responsible for guarding Buckingham Palace and other royal residences. She discovered that the iconic red tunics and bearskin hats dated back centuries, originating from the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. After British forces defeated Napoleon's army, they adopted the bearskin hats worn by French grenadiers as a symbol of victory. Over time, these hats became synonymous with the discipline and precision of the British military. The deeper Emily delved, the more fascinated she became. She learned that each hat required the fur of a single Canadian black bear, sourced sustainably under strict regulations. Artisans spent months crafting them, ensuring every stitch and detail met exacting standards. Beyond their aesthetic appeal, the hats served a practical purpose during battle. They made soldiers appear taller and more imposing, striking fear into their opponents. Even today, centuries later, they remained a powerful emblem of strength and tradition. But it wasn't just the hats themselves that intrigued Emily. It was the men who wore them. The guardsmen weren't actors or models. They were highly trained soldiers serving in the British Army. Their duties extended far beyond standing stoically outside Buckingham Palace. They trained rigorously, participated in ceremonial parades, and could be deployed overseas at any moment. Their role was both symbolic and functional, representing the crown while remaining ready to defend their country if called upon. As Emily absorbed this information, her guilt grew, but so did her resolve. She decided to write a heartfelt letter of apology to the Household Division, hoping to convey not only her regret, but also her newfound appreciation for their work. Sitting down at the small desk in her room, she opened a fresh document on her computer and began typing. "Dear Sirs," she wrote, choosing her words carefully, "I am writing to express my deepest apologies for my actions earlier today at Buckingham Palace. I understand now that removing a guardsman's bearskin hat was disrespectful and inappropriate, and I deeply regret having caused such disruption. At the time, I thought it would be a harmless joke, but I see now how wrong I was." She went on to explain how the incident had opened her eyes to the rich history and significance behind the uniforms. "Learning about the origins of the bearskin hats and the dedication of the men who wear them has given me a profound respect for your institution. I admire the discipline, honor, and sacrifice that go into serving as a guardsman, and I feel incredibly fortunate to have witnessed it firsthand, even if my behavior left much to be desired." Toward the end of the letter, Emily promised to do better. "This experience has taught me an important lesson about respecting cultural traditions and symbols of authority. In the future, I will approach such landmarks with greater understanding and reverence. Thank you for taking the time to educate me, and please extend my gratitude to the guardsmen whose patience allowed me to learn from my mistake." After proofreading the letter several times, Emily printed it out and signed her name neatly at the bottom. She folded it carefully into an envelope, addressed it to the Household Division headquarters, and mailed it the next morning. As she dropped the envelope into the postbox, she felt a small sense of relief, not because she thought everything was fixed, but because she had taken a step toward making amends. Weeks passed before Emily received a response. One afternoon, as she scrolled through emails on her phone, she noticed a message from an official-looking address. Her heart raced as she opened it. The reply was brief but meaningful. "Thank you for your letter. We appreciate your sincerity and willingness to learn. Should you wish to attend one of our public events honoring veterans later this year, we would welcome your presence." Emily read the email over and over, a mix of gratitude and humility washing over her. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement, and perhaps even a second chance. For the first time since that fateful day, she allowed herself to smile. Months passed, and Emily's life returned to its usual rhythm. She finished her trip to London, avoiding Buckingham Palace as per the terms of her 6-month ban, and eventually flew back home with a suitcase full of souvenirs and one unforgettable lesson. But the memory of that day lingered like an unshakable shadow. Every time she scrolled through social media or heard someone mention London, she couldn't help but think about the guardsmen, their towering bearskin hats, and the weight of her own foolishness. Though she had written her apology letter and received a measured response from the Household Division, she still felt the need to prove to herself, and to them, that she had truly changed. When the invitation arrived in her inbox months later, inviting her to attend a public event honoring veterans, Emily stared at the screen for a long moment, her heart pounding. This was her chance, not just to revisit Buckingham Palace, but to show that she had learned from her mistake. It wasn't mandatory. She could have ignored it and moved on with her life. But something inside her urged her to go, to face the place where everything had gone wrong, and prove that she was different now. The day of the event finally came, and Emily found herself standing once again near the gates of Buckingham Palace. The air buzzed with excitement as families, tourists, and locals gathered to celebrate the contributions of servicemen and women. Flags fluttered in the breeze, and bands played patriotic tunes that filled the square with energy. Emily hung back, feeling both nervous and hopeful. She wore a simple dress and carried a small bouquet of flowers, her way of showing respect without drawing attention to herself. As the ceremony began, Emily watched intently, her eyes fixed on the rows of soldiers marching in perfect formation. Their uniforms were immaculate, their movements synchronized down to the last step. She recognized the same discipline and pride she had seen before, but this time she viewed it through a new lens. These weren't just figures in red coats and furry hats. They were individuals who had dedicated their lives to service, sacrifice, and tradition. Each medal pinned to their chests told a story of courage and commitment, and Emily felt humbled to be witnessing it all. During a break in the program, Emily mustered the courage to approach one of the guardsmen stationed nearby. Her palms were sweaty, and her voice wavered as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said softly, holding out the bouquet. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you do. And I'm really sorry about what happened before." The guardsman blinked, clearly taken aback by her gesture. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable behind his stoic mask. Then, slowly, he reached out and accepted the flowers. "Thank you," he replied, his voice calm and measured. There was no anger in his tone, no hint of judgment, just quiet acknowledgement. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as relief washed over her. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was close enough, a sign that she was being given another chance. Afterward, Emily stepped back into the crowd, her chest lighter than it had been in months. She didn't stay for the entire event, knowing that her presence might still draw unwanted attention. Instead, she slipped away quietly, leaving behind only the faint scent of flowers and a renewed sense of purpose. As she walked through the streets of London, she realized something important. Making amends wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning from it and moving forward with grace. For the rest of her trip, Emily approached every landmark and cultural site with a newfound reverence. She read plaques carefully, listened to tour guides attentively, and resisted the urge to treat historic sites like mere backdrops for photos. By the time she boarded her flight home, she knew she was carrying more than just souvenirs in her luggage. She was bringing back lessons that would stay with her forever. Months later, Emily returned to London, not as a wide-eyed tourist eager to snap selfies, but as someone who had grown wiser through her mistakes. The city greeted her with its familiar charm, the hum of traffic, the chatter of street vendors, and the timeless grandeur of its historic landmarks. This time, however, Emily's approach was different. She carried no map in hand, nor did she rush from one attraction to another. Instead, she moved slowly, deliberately, savoring each moment while respecting the stories behind them. Her first stop, naturally, was Buckingham Palace. Standing at the edge of the crowd gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony, Emily felt a mix of emotions: nervousness, anticipation, and a quiet pride that she had earned this second chance. The guardsmen marched onto the square in perfect formation, their crimson tunics glowing under the morning sun. Their bearskin hats loomed high above their heads, just as imposing and majestic as she remembered. But now, they held even greater meaning for her. Emily watched intently, marveling at the precision of their movements. Every step, every turn, every salute seemed choreographed to perfection. She noticed how tourists around her whispered in awe, snapping photos and pointing excitedly. But unlike before, Emily kept her distance, staying firmly behind the barriers. Her camera remained tucked safely in her bag. This wasn't about capturing memories for social media. It was about truly appreciating the pageantry unfolding before her eyes. As the ceremony progressed, Emily found herself reflecting on how much she had changed since her last visit. Back then, she had been reckless, treating the palace and its guards as props for entertainment. Now, she understood the weight of what she had once dismissed so casually. These weren't just men in uniforms. They were symbols of history, discipline, and sacrifice. Each step they took represented centuries of tradition, and each note played by the band echoed the pride of a nation. When the ceremony ended, Emily lingered near the gates, hesitant yet hopeful. She wanted to say something, to express her gratitude, but she didn't want to intrude. Finally, summoning her courage, she approached a guardsman standing nearby. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Thank you for letting me witness this incredible tradition today." The guardsman turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his bearskin hat. For a brief moment, Emily worried he might ignore her or respond coldly. But then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to Emily, it meant everything. That nod wasn't just acknowledgement, it was acceptance. In that instant, she felt a wave of relief wash over her, knowing she had finally made peace with her past misstep. Leaving the palace grounds, Emily wandered through Hyde Park, her thoughts swirling with gratitude and reflection. She realized that her journey hadn't just been about learning to respect traditions, it had also taught her humility. Making amends wasn't easy, especially when it involved public embarrassment and personal growth. Yet here she was, stronger and more mindful because of it. By the time evening fell, Emily found herself sitting on a bench overlooking the Serpentine Lake. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a golden glow over the water. As she sat there, she pulled out a notebook from her bag and began writing. Page after page filled with her reflections, lessons learned, moments cherished, and promises made to herself. She vowed never to take cultural landmarks for granted again. From now on, she would observe respectfully, educate herself fully, and share her experiences responsibly. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she smiled softly, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Her trip to London had started with a mistake, but it had ended with redemption. And though the memory of that fateful day would always linger, it no longer weighed her down. Instead, it served as a reminder, a story of growth, understanding, and the importance of approaching the world with reverence and care. Emily's final day in London dawned bright and clear, the kind of morning that made the city feel alive with possibilities. She woke up early, eager to make the most of her last hours before heading home. Her suitcase was already packed, but her mind felt lighter than it had in months, free from the weight of regret, and filled instead with newfound appreciation for the world around her. As she stepped out into the crisp air, she knew exactly where she wanted to spend her remaining time, watching the changing of the guard one last time. This time, Emily arrived well before the ceremony began, giving herself plenty of time to settle into a spot near the palace gates. The crowd was smaller than on previous days, allowing her to stand closer without feeling rushed or overwhelmed. She didn't bring her camera this time. Instead, she focused on soaking in every detail with her own eyes. When the guardsmen finally marched onto the square, their movements synchronized like clockwork, Emily couldn't help but smile. Their discipline and dedication were mesmerizing, a living testament to centuries of tradition. As she watched, Emily noticed something she hadn't before: the subtle interactions between the soldiers and the crowd. A young boy waved enthusiastically at one of the guardsmen, who gave an almost imperceptible nod in return. An elderly couple stood nearby, holding hands as they observed the ceremony, their faces glowing with pride. These small moments reminded Emily that the guards weren't just symbols of history. They were part of a shared experience, connecting people across generations and cultures. It wasn't just about the uniforms or the hats. It was about what they represented: unity, respect, and continuity. When the ceremony ended, Emily lingered for a while, reluctant to leave. She walked slowly around the palace grounds, taking in the intricate architecture and imagining the countless stories these walls had witnessed over the years. Her thoughts drifted back to her earlier visit, the chaos, the embarrassment, the lessons learned, and she marveled at how far she had come since then. What had started as a reckless act had transformed into a journey of self-discovery, teaching her not only about British traditions, but also about herself. Later that afternoon, Emily visited a nearby cafe, where she ordered a cup of tea and pulled out her notebook once again. Over the past few days, she had filled its pages with reflections and insights. But there was one more thing she wanted to write, a letter to her future self. "Dear Emily," she began, her pen gliding smoothly across the page. "If you're reading this, I hope you've remembered the lessons from your trip to London. Remember how easy it is to take things for granted when you don't stop to understand them. Remember the importance of respecting traditions, even if they seem foreign or unfamiliar. And most importantly, remember that mistakes are opportunities to grow, if you're willing to learn." She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the back cover of the notebook, vowing to revisit it someday. For now, though, she closed the book and looked out the window, watching as people hurried past, each absorbed in their own lives. She realized that everyone carried their own stories, their own lessons learned the hard way. Hers just happened to involve a bearskin hat and a moment of recklessness. That evening, as Emily boarded her flight home, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the experiences she had gained, but for the perspective she had gained along the way. Her trip to London had been unforgettable, not because of glamorous sights or Instagram-worthy photos, but because it had changed her. She had arrived as a curious but careless tourist and left as someone who understood the value of reverence and responsibility. Back home, Emily often found herself sharing her story with friends and family, not to boast about her travels, but to emphasize the importance of respecting cultural landmarks. "These places aren't just backdrops for selfies," she would say earnestly. "They're living pieces of history, deserving of our admiration and care." Her words resonated with those who listened, inspiring them to approach their own adventures with greater thoughtfulness. In the end, Emily's misstep became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a reminder that growth often comes from discomfort. By owning her mistake and learning from it, she had turned an embarrassing moment into a meaningful chapter of her life. And as she flipped through the pages of her notebook months later, she smiled, knowing that the lessons she had learned in London would stay with her forever.